Thank you, Bernd. So regarding the timeline, well noted. One quick remark before I jump into the presentation. We are running a little bit out of time, that's clear, but still we have on the agenda our Q&A. So please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A section, just to make sure that we cover them after the speech. And as I mentioned, we will synchronize the slides with the speakers later on, so you can recap that, so we don't lose any information there. So on the last webinar, I had the pleasure to speak a little bit about CAPEX and OPEX. And since we thought that might be interesting for you guys, we thought, okay, let's have a second session focusing a little bit more on the OPEX side, on the substrate. And we already had some nice insights in this session about the importance of substrate, and now we will also focus on the importance of substrate linked to the operational costs. So just a quick recap from what we concluded, or at least what I concluded from the first webinar. Very good. So a quick recap, as I mentioned. So when jumping into a project, we need to get to some, let's say, initial numbers, and these numbers can come from multiple sources, can come from conversations or webinars like this, or forum discussions at ento-connect.com, or from other areas. So basically, when we speak about the operational costs, it's crucial to make sure that the economical aspect fits. So that means we have to look at the CAPEX and OPEX also in relation to revenue. And we also have to be sure that we are pretty careful with our assumptions, like Mats mentioned earlier. So it makes sense not to rely on, let's say, on a single source, and also not to rely on a single assumption, but to make sure that you have, let's say, plan B, C, and D in line. And to summarize what we seen last time, that the substrate in this example that I've shown you, so obviously business cases are completely different. You can see that the substrate costs can be a major block in the overall calculation. So therefore, it absolutely makes sense to look very closely into that. So beside the substrate, we have the climatization and some other areas, but following Pareto, you should really focus on the big blocks here. So let's speak a little bit more about the substrate in general. So hopefully in a bit you will see our very high level calculation tool that we have on the website. So that slide is about to illustrate you the importance of the substrate in terms of the mass balance and also in terms of the OPEX. So we see that in comparison to a relatively small amount of end product that we are gaining, for example, the insect meal, the insect fat, we have to put in a significant amount of wet substrate. And therefore, if we put a price tag to that, we really have to look closer on, let's say, how to get this price tag down or how to control this process further. So basically, so as we've seen, the volume is relatively big, and since the volume is relatively big, also transportation plays a significant role. So this number was displaying as the amount of wet substrate. So depending on what kind of availability you have, you can get it in as a wet basis. So when it comes from breweries, for example, it will be very likely it will be wet because they would like to save on the drying step. In other examples, it can be dry, so you have to add some water, so the transport is at least a little bit less relevant. But what we can conclude here in general is that the price range for substrates is a pretty wide range. So in some applications or projects, we see a range from free of charge or even getting some revenue for this disposal. In other cases, we see that obviously it has a price tag. And this is how the market works. So when the market is developing and the clients are requesting this product, then obviously some money is transferred from A to B. And also what Mats mentions, it's always, a trade-off between quality and a quantity. So you have to decide between the performance and costs mostly. So that means if you have a high performance, the costs in most of the cases is relatively high. In some cases you're lucky and both is working well. But let's conclude that this is the logical approach here. And as we can see, that has a big impact on the OPEX. It's really crucial that you are very careful with the substrate that you pick, and also with the pricings. This can have a really big impact on your overall business case. So beside the OPEX, also the CAPEX plays a role. So what we've seen, for example, the VEDA equipment is that depending on what kind of substrate you're using, the machinery, all the overall setup of the installation can vary a lot. So depending on whether it's dry, whether it's wet, whether you have an inhomogeneously mixture that you have to bring down to a pumpable fluid. This impacts a lot on the CAPEX that you have to spend there. Another aspect is also the storage volume. So as we heard earlier, running out of substrate is not a good thing in the overall operation. In order to avoid that, you can have contracts with your suppliers, but you can also have your internal storage volume, because a contract is nice, but if the other party is not able to fulfill the contract for whatever reasons, it doesn't help you a lot to insist on the contract. If the substrate is away, then it's away. And on the other hand, if there is a fluctuation, then you should also consider investing in, let's say, a more or less complex analytic equipment that gives you more insights on the composition, more insights on the fluctuation that you have, since this will also impact the biological output or the overall KPIs of the facility. So what kind of, let's say, major challenges do we have? So it is really important to find a suitable substrate that fits economical and biological aspects. In order to run a stable process, variation in the process is always very tricky, but you cannot avoid this variation. Therefore, so it's important to get a good understanding and feeling about this variation. And we still see that there is a big dynamics on the market. So that means that the supply market is developing together with the industry, and therefore we have to see what comes first, what moves first, so the supply market or the demand market. And so if you get a good understanding of what is happening, you can try at least to predict more or less what will happen in the next stages. And to come to an end, some quick take-home messages for you. So as I mentioned, with the assumptions, especially for this big block of costs, you have to be really careful and always look for multiple sources for substrate, multiple sources for the pricing, for the availability. That is really key. Yeah, also the logistics, that's an important topic. So whether you will be supplied daily, whether you will establish your own stock, these are really important business decisions that you have to make. And ideally, you are looking for a product that is relatively cheap and that is not in competition with other markets, since this impacts that the price tag will not be that high. But this is also, let's say, thriving the spirit of the insect industry, that we use products that are, let's say, less attractive for other markets and convert them into really high valuable products like the meal, the fat, the frass, and some other products that we can gain. And last but not least, so we will have 4 more webinar series coming up, including the lessons learned from our today's session. So therefore, we can highly encourage you to follow these along, where we speak about the other topics as well. So thanks a lot. And now we reach the point for the Q&As.